Good morning and welcome to week 4 of our small group study. This morning we're going to be looking at Exodus, so chapter 32. I'll put the verses up and pause the video, take some time and read through and then restart. So now that we've had some time to read through, I want to step through this scripture a little bit and raise some questions. To me, when I read this whole passage is all about self-delusion. There's a lot of lies that people tell themselves that are common to us, actually, but they're sort of embedded within this text in a special way that helps us to kind of see them for the lies that they are. So let's start with the first delusion. When the scripture opens up, Moses is up on the mountain. He's been up there for, I think, about a month. He's been there for quite some time. Now, if we recall, God has spoken to the people of Israel before, and they freaked out. They were like, "Ooh, we can't speak to God. If we're face to face with God, we're going to die." So they basically tasked Moses and said, "Listen, you're going to be the conduit. You're going to be the go-between. You go die, and if you make it, you come down and you tell us what God says, and we'll obey that." So they basically dumped everything on Moses. So Moses went up the mountain, and he'd been gone for about a month. God had an awful lot to say to him, gave him a lot of instruction. But the people got impatient, so they're sitting down at the bottom of the mountain. They haven't seen Moses for quite some time, and they start to get impatient, as people do, right? Because we want things on our terms, on our timing. So the first delusion, though, was that they said, okay, we don't know what's happened with Moses, this man who brought us out of Egypt. And that's the first lie right there. Now, often, we in our language, we say that Moses parted the Red Sea, and we attribute the 10 plagues in Egypt. It's Moses who is the instrument of God who made these things happen. But none of us actually really think that Moses did these things. I mean, Moses was just some old guy with a stick. It was God who was the power behind all of these things. So they tell themselves that very first lie, that it was Moses that brought them out of Egypt. They forgot everything that had happened to them. So everything that they had lived through, they just somehow blanked that out and went, yeah, Moses, this guy who brought us out of Egypt. And it makes me wonder, how often do we do the same? So how often do we misidentify other people or other events as the work of God? There's something that I think I've shared this with you before, but years ago, when Michael, my eldest, was quite young, like grade 2 or 3 or something like that, he went to a circus camp during March break. So in that, they learned, like juggling and some acrobatics and some magic tricks and stuff. He was quite into that. So at the end of the week, they had a big show that they were putting on, and it was being held at John Robarts School. Now, in London, there are 2 John Robarts Schools. There's the larger academy that's the deaf school, and then there's a small little public school out in the East End. So Kyung-Soo and I went to see this show, and we ended up at the school for the deaf. But it was March break. It was shut down. There was not a student to be seen. There was nobody. Like, the whole campus was deserted. So we started getting, kind of worried, right? Because we thought, well, we're here to support Michael, and, there's nothing going on. And we didn't want to be the ones who missed their child's show, right? So we eventually determined that there was, in fact, another school out in the East End that was also called John Robarts. We didn't have a car at the time. We called a cab. It was 20 minutes later. The cab wasn't coming. And we were about to be late, we're kind of thinking, worst parents of the year. And Kyung-Soo started praying. And as she was praying, this car came up and hit the brakes, screeching right up in front of us. And this couple leaned out and they said, "What's the deal with this circus camp? We're supposed to be at a circus camp, but we can't find anything going on. What do you know?" And so we said, "You know what? I do know where that is. Let me get in your back seat and I'll take you there." So we hopped in the car and off we went, and we ended up making it on time, and it was all good. Now, was that God's work? I'm convinced that it is. I mean, Kyung-soo was actively praying at the moment when this car came screeching up, and it was a solution to our very problem that she was praying for. So it was God's intervention for sure. But how often do these things happen to us, and we go, "Boy, that was lucky." You know, how curious it was. I was just praying about that very thing, and you called, and boy, that sure is lucky. There's so many ways in which God is acting in our lives. And I'm not sure if we're willfully blind to it or whether we're just not that bright. But so often we misattribute what's going on. So in the very same way that these Israelites said, oh yeah, it was Moses that brought us out of Egypt, not God. There are a lot of ways in which we overlook God's providence within our lives. So that's the first thing for us to contemplate, is that delusion. So that delusion about God working, but us thinking that it's something else that's actually going on. And then the next delusion was that they were going to make a false god. And they actually just said it out loud, right? Will you make us a god? And the delusion comes in this way. God is a God who provides. God created everything. God gives us our lives, our bodies, the breath in our bodies, the food that we eat, the very gold that the Israelites took out of their ears to make their God was actually given to them by the true God. So that there's something very odd in the thinking that whereas it's God who provides, but when they're ready to make their false god, it's them that has to provide. They have to provide the raw material for the God. And it cost them what is most precious. They had to take all of their gold to make this God. But these are a homeless people who are wandering through the desert. They have almost no wealth, right? So what little wealth they have, they actually have to give up to create this God who did not previously exist. And then the third delusion is just that bold lie that came afterwards. So after they made the golden calf, it was presented to them. It was like, here, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. Now, how can a created thing be a God? And for us, we read back in this story and we think, I just watched you make that calf. You took my earrings to make that calf. How can that calf be the God that brought us out of Egypt, years ago? They know right from the start that it's a lie, and yet they accept this lie. They willingly accept this lie. And in some ways we read this and we look back at them as though they're some kind of fools, but how eager are we these days to be fleeced? Look at most of the ads and stuff, you buy this pill and it's going to, make you lose all this weight magically, or it'll increase your libido and your stamina. How often do we give up that which is most precious to us for a lie, for something that we simply know is not going to be true? I think about the things that control our lives and actually take our resources. One thing that comes to mind really quite quickly is technology. And especially, for some reason, Apple technology. I'm not sure what it is with that. It's curious. The symbol for the Apple brand is an apple with a bite taken out of it, right? So that's that original temptation right back at the start of Genesis. But there's something actually very consuming about Apple products. So people with iPhones, it costs dearly. Like a new iPhone is $1,000 or more. And then plus, you pay these exorbitant monthly fees to maintain your data and your connection. So another $100 a month to actually use it. And I've seen, especially for the younger folk, maybe not so much the people my age and older, but certainly for people younger, these bits of technology, they really do rule our lives, that we're constantly glued to it. It's the first thing we turn to in the morning and the last thing we turn to at night. And it's our source of entertainment, of comfort, of pleasure, of knowledge, of almost everything. I actually had an interesting experience. On the weekend, we went with Michael's family up to Dundas to go do some hiking through the woods. And we came across this family, and the dad's trying to take a picture of his little 2-year-old, 1.5-year-old son. And the only way that they could get this child to look at the camera was mom had the phone with a video on it and holding it up beside the camera. That's the only way they could capture the kid's attention to actually take the picture. But it's certainly true that technology rules our lives in a most unhealthy way. Certainly, it costs us our time and our treasure and our attention and our focus. And there are other things as well. So another good thing to talk about is what other false gods do we have? What created things do we have in our lives that we worship, that we obey, we sacrifice our time, we sacrifice our money to? There's no end actually of things that of false gods that we've created. So in the end, God of course gets angry, loses patience, says, "I'm going to wipe them all out." But Moses had courage actually to face down God, and that raises a very interesting question. Do we have enough relationship with God to truly oppose him? To actually make demands and say, "Listen, God, you can't do that." And when we fall into any of those previous delusions that we have, so delusions about who is responsible for what's going on, whether it's God or some other created being, the delusion of creating something and then worshiping it, as long as we keep falling into these lies and willingly embracing them, we will never actually have the courage and the relationship that we can actually stand face to face with God and negotiate with him in the way that Moses does. So essentially the only way that we can attain that relationship is through the pursuit of truth. So we have to put aside all those delusions, all those lies that we tell ourselves just because they're convenient and they make our lives easier. And we have to pursue truth. Now, in a previous video, maybe a previous sermon, I had mentioned that Jesus Christ, of course, is the way, the truth, and the life. And that if we pursue truth, we end up with Jesus, and that rightens our relationship with God. So I'll leave that with you for this week, and we'll pick up again next week.